Okay, today is a Saturday and we are wanting to get to the bottom of our issue that we had at Lights Out with the S10 where it was cutting out at 6,000 RPM. And we're gonna do a couple baseline runs just to first see if we can replicate the same problem at on the dyno that we did on the track. We're not gonna be as much horsepower. On the track we're using close to 3,000 horsepower and I don't think I can hold that tire on the dyno at that power level, so I'm gonna just put it on a tune that maybe makes 1,600 horsepower range and try to run it up to 6,200 RPM and see if I get that cutout issue. What we're trying to determine is the problem a resonant frequency issue with the billet aluminum sensor bracket that holds the crank sensor, or is it a actual problem with crank deflection that every time the cylinder fires that it actually deflects the crank and it makes the tone wheel get a dirty signal once we get up that high in the RPM and that high in horsepower. So this is just kind of, if it's a resonant frequency problem, we'll be able to fix that by adding a support to the front of the crank signal brace. It's very solid, doesn't seem like there's any problem. But if we can get, if that resonant frequency is close to 435 hertz, it could cause an interference with the crank signal. So that's what we're trying to figure out today. So hopefully we can make some noise and get to the bottom of this problem. Okay, that did exactly what we wanted. That was 300 milligrams, fuel only, no nitrous, did 1,558 horsepower, and we ran it up to 5,866 RPM when it cut out. It cut out on us exactly like it did at the track, which tells us that it's most likely a resonant frequency issue. But we're going to now pull the damper off the truck and make a support for the crank sensor mount, and then do the same test again and see if the results change. So our thought is, like this crank sensor mount, if this frequency gets to 435 hertz, it could actually get a dirty crank signal. So we're going to drill a hole here, tap it, and then we're going to make a turnbuckle and come up to this bolt and just support it. That way we can put some tension on the back of here. Like I said, it's all tight, it's perfect, everything seems good, but when we're at 6,000 RPM, there's a lot of things that are happening that your eye can't see when it's just sitting here stationary. So we're working on, Cody's working on fabbing something for this bracket, and then we're going to put this back together and do the same test again.
So these are two highs?
Yeah.
And then this is a little insert, pretty much just to adapt down to a smaller bolt, because we can't run that big of a bolt into the little bracket for the dampener, or for the crank sensor. So.
Okay, we got the brace all set up on the crank sensor mount, so we are ready to make the test number 2. So pretty much we're going to do the exact same tune-up, fuel only. Like I said, this is turned down about 700 microseconds, and it did 1558 on the first pull, but at 5,860 RPM, crank signal lost and it cut out. So that's what we're trying to fix. So hopefully it's a resonant frequency problem with that crank sensor mount. This support will be a temporary fix if that is actually the problem, and then we'll talk to the guys at D&J, and Drew has a couple different ideas on how he could better support that actual crank sensor mount. So let's give this thing a rip and see what we got. Yep. Okay, unfortunately that did not fix our cutout issue. So the next step is going to be getting a picoscope and putting it on the crank signal, actually monitoring the raw signal. But we'll be able to get this information and share it with Fluid Damper. We'll be able to talk to the engineers at Exergy and be able to come up with a plan to see what we need to do to fix this problem. Because we could be at the maxing out the capability of the factory Dodge crank sensor, because those things were rated to come out of the factory at 3,500 RPM, and now we're running 6,000 RPM. But what we're gonna do before we take it off the dyno today is, just for curiosity, I'm gonna turn the nitrous on and make a big rip on it, because I have a hard time not just seeing what power I can make on the chassis dyno. So hopefully it's as spectacular as I think it will be. Well, that was about as entertaining as expected, but it definitely tried to leave the dyno room. So that was, the first kit had come on, the second kit was just starting to pulse width modulate in, and Larson had to abort because it was trying to drive itself off the dyno. And we decided it's no point in trying to restrapping, because if you look at the straps in the back, it was fraying them. The tires came forward and was actually touching the dyno. We're just not going to take any chances. We know the truck makes a ton of horsepower, but we just had to turn the nitrous on to see what kind of number we could make. Did 2,159 horsepower before we had to lift. The graph was still going straight up for the moon, so it was pretty fun. But if you're here in person, I don't know what it's going to sound like on video, but here in person, it was nothing short of impressive. So hopefully this was something fun for you to watch. We still have a lot of work to do to try to get to the bottom of this crank signal issue cutting out at 6,000 RPM. So we will get to the bottom of that and hopefully keep you guys in the loop on what we find the actual issue is once we nail down the problem.